In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains different types of IQ and how you can say IQ exists.
Back to the library of questions. So you have this database of questions, and so then what you do is pull out 100 questions randomly. All right, and you want to pick out 100 because if you just pick out one, like if I asked you what the capital of Georgia was and I asked you what the capital of Georgia was and you got it wrong and you got it right, I couldn't really say with any degree of certainty that that means that you have more intelligence, because the probability that I'd get an accurate measure with one question is quite low. But if I used 3 questions, well then, I would start to become, my measurement would start to become less error-ridden. And if I used 10, it would even be better. And if I used 20, for a personality questionnaire, the rule of thumb, and this is just a rule of thumb, is that if you don't have 20 questions in the questionnaire, then you don't have enough questions to really generate a reliable measure. So you'll still see single item measures used in psychology, but you can add additional accuracy by increasing the number of items. I designed an IQ test a while back, and we got pretty good reliability and pretty good validity. Reliability is, you test the same set of people twice, and the rank order of their performance stays the same. So if you got 90 on the previous test, you'd get 90, and if you got 95, because you're more intelligent in this example, if you got 95 in the last one, you'd get 95 on this one. So that's reliability. We could get a pretty reliable IQ test with 9 items, but it was substantially improved with 17. And with increments, you get what would you call it? Diminishing returns. So 100's plenty. Okay, so you pull out 100 questions, and then you take 100 people, and you give them those questions, and then you score them, right and wrong, that's all there is. And then you sum the scores. Okay, so basically the sum behaves like the average. Let's say you average the scores, just to make the argument a little bit more straightforward. You average the scores, and so each of you gets the average of, calculated across the times that you were right and wrong. So it's an approximation of the frequency of how right you were, and then we rank order you, 1 to 100. That's IQ. That's all there is to it. So now people say IQ doesn't exist. Well, that's annoying, because all they're doing is gerrymandering the definition of the word exist. Because you can do that. If you ask if A is equivalent to B, the answer is, it depends on what you mean by A and what you mean by B. It's almost always a foolish question, because you can take B and A and bend them and twist them in such a way that you can make one thing another thing without too much problem. People usually get around that by only using a word in a context, right? In a sentence or a phrase or a paragraph that defines the word, so that you can't weasel around like that. But more specifically in psychology, we have methods to tell if something is real. And if IQ doesn't pass the test of reality for a psychological measure, then no other psychological measures pass the test, because they're validated exactly the same way IQ is, and they don't work as well. So you can say, well, no, that's not real, but then you probably have to throw out the social sciences completely, insofar as they're actually sciences, because the same statistics are used to generate their findings. So you can't just say, well, this really powerful thing doesn't exist, well, a bunch of these weak things exist and they're measured the same way. You don't get to play that game. So, okay, so does it exist? Well, you can measure it. You can measure it reliably, so that's definitely something. Because you might say, well, does your shadow exist? Well, generally speaking, under normal conditions, you could measure your shadow relatively reliably. Does it exist? Well, it passes one test of existence. You can't detect it with a number of senses. You can't touch it, for example. But whether or not something exists is actually a rather tricky question. But you can measure it and it's useful. And that's not a bad definition of exist. So what's it good for? Well, it predicts major life outcomes, and importantly. So, and we can talk about the power of intelligence momentarily. If you were actually going to calculate an IQ score per se, you would take the rank order that I just described and you would correct it for age. Because you can't really expect a 7-year-old to know as much as a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old. So generally speaking, if you take a technical IQ test, it will rank order you, but it'll only rank order you with people of the same age as you. So that's just another, it's an additional correction. Whether or not that actually gives you a more accurate estimate of IQ depends on what you mean by accurate. A very bright 7-year-old generally doesn't know enough to do much useful in the way of work, but they can learn extremely quickly. And so if you compared 7-year-olds to people of other ages, purely in terms of their score on an IQ test, there's a high probability that you would underestimate their speed of learning. By the same token, though, by the time you're 40, you have a lot of accumulated knowledge. And so if you only measured learning speed, then you would overestimate the 7-year-old's advantage over the 40-year-old. IQ is basically a unitary phenomena. But you can fractionate it into, it's very, very complicated for reasons that I'll tell you about in a minute. If you had to divide IQ into two, the way you would divide it would be into crystallized and fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence would be roughly the ability to learn. And crystallized intelligence would be roughly a measure of how much you've learned. Now, those are separate to some degree, and here's why they're separate. As you age, your capacity to learn decreases. It's quite ugly. So by the time you're about 24, you're starting to get stupider from the perspective of being able to learn. And that's just pretty much a linear trip downhill until you depart the world. So it's nasty to see, because it's quite a steep degeneration. You can stave that off, by the way, with cardiovascular exercise and weightlifting. So that's the best way to keep your learning capacity intact. It's not to do cognitive exercises, it's to do physical exercise. And then as you age, the amount you know goes up. And what happens is those two things actually tend to average out. So now you might say, well, if I'm claiming that IQ is this unitary thing, how can I make the claim that you can divide it into two elements and that those elements are in some sense separate? And I think the reason is for this. So your prefrontal cortex, roughly speaking, so that's the part of your brain here forward, you can think about in part, it's the part that does the programming of motor activity, voluntary motor activity. But it also seems to be, so let's say you're doing something new and you're pretty clunky and awkward at it, and then you do it more and more and you get smoother and smoother and smoother at it, and you automatize it. What happens is you're using your prefrontal cortex and to some degree your whole right hemisphere when you're first doing it, and then as you get better and better at it, the ability shifts to the left and then goes backwards. So what's happening to some degree is your prefrontal cortex is programming the rest of your brain. And you could think of fluid intelligence as a measure of the ability of your brain to program itself, and crystallized ability as a measure of how much programming is there. And then, so they're separate in that manner because they perform separate functions, but then you can also understand that the better your programmer is, the better the programming is going to be, so that inflates the correlation. And so you can have two separate things, functionally, that are even dissociable in terms of age, but because they work so tightly together, it's like, how fast can you dig a hole, and how big is the pile of dirt? Well, obviously those two things are different in some important sense, but they're going to be highly correlated, because the faster you can dig a hole, the bigger the pile of dirt. And so anyways, crystallized intelligence is often measured as verbal intelligence, but the better measure fundamentally is crystallized intelligence.
Thanks for watching.